Introduction: lateral thinking is closely related to insight, creativity, and humor. All four processes have the same basis, but whereas insight, creativity, and humor can only be prayed for, lateral thinking is a more deliberate process. It is as definite a way of using the mind as logical thinking, but a very different way. Culture is concerned with establishing ideas. Education is concerned with communicating those established ideas. Both are concerned with improving ideas by bringing them up to date. The only available method for changing ideas is conflict, which works in two ways. In the first way, there is a head-on confrontation between opposing ideas. One or other of the ideas achieves a practical dominance over the other idea, which is suppressed but not changed. In the second way, there is a conflict between new information and the old idea. As a result of this conflict, the old idea is supposed to be changed. This is the method of science, which is always seeking to generate new information to upset the old ideas and bring about new ones. It is more than the method of science, it is the method of human knowledge. Education is based on the safe assumption that one only has to go on collecting more and more information for it to sort itself into useful ideas. We have developed tools for handling the information, mathematics for extending it, logical thinking for refining it. The conflict method for changing ideas works well where the information can be evaluated in some objective manner. But the method does not work at all when the new information can only be evaluated through the old idea. Instead of being changed, the old idea is strengthened and made ever more rigid. The most effective way of changing ideas is not from outside by conflict, but from within by the insight rearrangement of available information. Insight is the only effective way of changing ideas in a myth situation, when information cannot be evaluated objectively. Even when information can be evaluated objectively, as in science, an insight rearrangement of information leads to huge leaps forward. Education is not only concerned with collecting information, but also with the best ways of using information that has been collected. When ideas lead information rather than lag behind, progress is rapid. Yet we have developed no practical tools for handling insight. We can only go on collecting information and hope that at some stage it will come about. Lateral thinking is an insight tool. Insight, creativity, and humor are so elusive because the mind is so efficient. The mind functions to create patterns out of its surroundings. Once the patterns are formed, it becomes possible to recognize them, to react to them, to use them. As the patterns are used, they become ever more firmly established. The pattern-using system is a very efficient way of handling information. Once established, the patterns form a sort of code. The advantage of a code system is that instead of having to collect all the information, one collects just enough to identify the code pattern, which is then called forth, even as library books on a particular subject are called forth by a catalog code number. It is convenient to talk of the mind as if it were some information handling machine, perhaps like a computer. The mind is not a machine, however, but a special environment which allows information to organize itself into patterns. This self-organizing, self-maximizing memory system is very good at creating patterns, and that is the effectiveness of mind. But inseparable from the great usefulness of a patterning system are certain limitations. In such a system, it is easy to combine patterns or to add to them, but it is extremely difficult to restructure them, for the patterns control attention. Insight and humor both involve the restructuring of patterns. Creativity also involves restructuring, but with more emphasis on the escape from restricting patterns. Lateral thinking involves restructuring, escape, and the provocation of new patterns. Lateral thinking is closely related to creativity. But whereas creativity is too often only the description of a result, lateral thinking is the description of a process. One can only admire a result, but one can learn to use a process. There is about creativity a mystique of talent and intangibles. This may be justified in the art world, where creativity involves aesthetic sensibility, emotional resonance, and a gift for expression. But it is not justified outside that world. More and more creativity is coming to be valued as the essential ingredient in change and in progress. It is coming to be valued above knowledge and above technique, since both these are becoming so accessible. In order to be able to use creativity, one must rid it of this aura of mystique and regard it as a way of using the mind, a way of handling information. This is what lateral thinking is about. Lateral thinking is concerned with the generation of new ideas. There is a curious notion that new ideas have to do with technical invention. This is a very minor aspect of the matter. New ideas are the stuff of change and progress in every field, from science to art, from politics to personal happiness. Lateral thinking is also concerned with breaking out of the concept prisons of old ideas. This leads to changes in attitude and approach, to looking in a different way at things which have always been looked at in the same way. Liberation from old ideas and the stimulation of new ones are twin aspects of lateral thinking. Lateral thinking is quite distinct from vertical thinking, which is the traditional type of thinking. In vertical thinking, one moves forward by sequential steps, each of which must be justified. The distinction between the two sorts of thinking is sharp. For instance, in lateral thinking, one uses information not for its own sake but for its effect. In lateral thinking, one may have to be wrong at some stage in order to achieve a correct solution. In vertical thinking, this would be impossible. In lateral thinking, one may deliberately seek out irrelevant information. In vertical thinking, one selects out only what is relevant. Lateral thinking is not a substitute for vertical thinking. Both are required. They are complementary. Lateral thinking is generative. Vertical thinking is selective. With vertical thinking, one may reach a conclusion by a valid series of steps. Because of the soundness of the steps, one is arrogantly certain of the correctness of the conclusion. But no matter how correct the path may be, the starting point was a matter of perceptual choice which fashioned the basic concepts used. For instance, perceptual choice tends to create sharp divisions and use extreme polarization. Vertical thinking would then work on the concepts produced in this manner. Lateral thinking is needed to handle the perceptual choice which is itself beyond the reach of vertical thinking. Lateral thinking would also temper the arrogance of any rigid conclusion, no matter how soundly it appeared to have been worked out. Lateral thinking enhances the effectiveness of vertical thinking. Vertical thinking develops the ideas generated by lateral thinking. You cannot dig a hole in a different place by digging the same hole deeper. Vertical thinking is used to dig the same hole deeper. Lateral thinking is used to dig a hole in a different place. The exclusive emphasis on vertical thinking in the past makes it all the more necessary to teach lateral thinking. It is not just that vertical thinking alone is insufficient for progress, but that by itself it can be dangerous. Like logical thinking, lateral thinking is a way of using the mind. It is a habit of mind and an attitude of mind. There are specific techniques that can be used just as there are specific techniques in logical thinking. There is some emphasis on techniques in this book, not because they are an important part of lateral thinking, but because they are practical. Goodwill and exhortation are not enough to develop skill in lateral thinking. One needs an actual setting in which to practice and some tangible techniques with which to practice. From an understanding of the techniques, and from fluency in their use, lateral thinking develops as an attitude of mind. One can also make practical use of the techniques. Lateral thinking is not some magic new system. There have always been instances where people have used lateral thinking to produce some result. There have always been people who tended naturally toward lateral thinking. The purpose of this book is to show that lateral thinking is a very basic part of thinking and that one can develop some skill in it. Instead of just hoping for insight and creativity, one can use lateral thinking in a deliberate and practical manner. Summary: the purpose of thinking is to collect information and to make the best possible use of it. Because of the way the mind works to create fixed concept patterns, we cannot make the best use of new information unless we have some means for restructuring the old patterns and bringing them up to date. Our traditional methods of thinking teach us how to refine such patterns and establish their validity, but we shall always make less than the best use of available information unless we know how to create new patterns and escape from the dominance of the old ones. Vertical thinking is concerned with proving or developing concept patterns. Lateral thinking is concerned with restructuring such patterns and provoking new ones. Lateral and vertical thinking are complementary. Skill in both is necessary, yet the emphasis in education has always been exclusively on vertical thinking. The need for lateral thinking arises from the limitations of the behavior of mind as a self-maximizing memory system. Use of this book is not intended to introduce a new subject, nor is it intended to acquaint the reader with what is happening in a certain field. The book is meant to be used. It is meant to be used by the reader for his own sake and through the teacher for the sake of the students. The processes described in this book are basic ones. They apply to all ages and to all different levels of learning. I have used some of the most elementary demonstrations on the most sophisticated of groups, such as advanced computer programmers, and they have not felt that they were wasting their time. The more sophisticated the group, the better is it able to abstract the process from the particular form in which it is demonstrated. While the lower age groups enjoy the item for its own sake, the older age groups look more closely at the point behind it. Although the simpler items are applicable to all age groups, the more complicated items may only be of use to more senior groups. In the younger age groups, the visual form is much more effective than the verbal, since a child can always attempt to express something visually and, more importantly, to understand something that has been expressed visually. From the age of 7 right up to and through university education, the lateral thinking process is relevant. This may seem a wide age group, but the process is as basic as logical thinking, and clearly the relevance of this is not limited to a particular age group. In a similar manner, the relevance of lateral thinking cuts across the distinctions of subject even more than does mathematics. Lateral thinking is relevant whether one is studying science or engineering or history or English. It is because of this general application that the material used in this book does not require the background of any particular subject. An attempt should be made to develop lateral thinking attitudes as a habit of mind at least from the age of 7 onwards. The actual application of the ideas expressed in this book to a particular age level must depend to some extent on the experience of the teacher in presenting the material in an appropriate form. The two usual mistakes in this regard are to assume that it is obvious and that everyone thinks laterally anyway, to assume that it is rather a special subject and not of use or relevance to everyone. The practical aspect of the book does get more complex as one proceeds through the book. In general, the first part of the practical material is suitable for 7-year-olds and the later parts are suitable for anyone. This is not to imply that the first part is only suitable for young children or the later parts are only suitable for adults, but that there is a way of putting over the lateral thinking attitude to any age group. Format like logical thinking. Lateral thinking is a general attitude of mind which may make use of certain techniques on occasion. Nevertheless, this attitude of mind can best be taught in a formal setting using specific material and exercises. This is to encourage the development of the lateral thinking habit. Without a formal setting, one is reduced to mere encouragement and the appreciation of lateral thinking when it occurs, neither of which processes do much to develop the habit. To set aside a definite period for teaching lateral thinking is much more use than trying to gently introduce its principles in the course of teaching some other subject. If one has to teach it along with some other subject, then one should set aside a short, defined period as part of the general period. A 1-hour period every week throughout education would be quite sufficient to bring about the lateral thinking attitude, or the creative attitude if you prefer to call it that. The practical parts of the book are separated into different aspects. It is not suggested that one should work through the book taking a section at each lesson and then passing on to the next section. This would be quite useless. Instead, one uses the basic structure of each section over and again until one is thoroughly familiar with the process. One may spend several sessions on a particular section or even several months. All the time one is changing the basic material but developing the same lateral thinking process. It is the use of lateral thinking that counts, not knowledge of each and every process. One can develop the lateral attitude of mind as easily through thorough practice in one technique as through brief practice in them all. There is nothing special about the techniques. It is the attitude behind them that counts. But mere exhortation and goodwill are not enough. If one is to develop a skill, one must have some formal setting in which to practice it and some tools to use. The best way to acquire skill in lateral thinking is to acquire skill in the use of a collection of tools which are all used to bring about the same effect. Materials. Many of the demonstrations used in this book may seem trivial and artificial. They are. The demonstrations are used in order to make clear some point about the thinking process. They are not intended to teach anything but to encourage the reader to develop some insight into the natural behavior of the mind. Just as the actual content of parables or fables is so much less important than the point they are intended to convey, so the demonstrations may be trivial in content in order to make an important point. There is unfortunately no switch in the mind which can be flicked one way for dealing with all important matters and the other way for dealing with minor matters. Whatever the importance of the matter, the system behaves in the same way. That is according to its nature. In important matters, the working of the system may be distorted by emotional considerations which do not interfere with the handling of trivial matters. The only effect is to make the working worse than it can be. Hence, the defects of the system in dealing with trivial matters are at least the same defects which will be present when dealing with more important matters. It is the process, not the product, that matters. The trivial and artificial items illustrate the process in a neat and accessible manner. The process can be extracted just as the relationships expressed in a formula in algebra can be separated from what the symbols actually stand for. Many of the items are visual and even geometric. This is deliberate because the use of verbal illustrations can be misleading. Words are already neat and fixed packages of information, and in discussing the thinking process, one really has to go back to the situation itself, since the choice of words in a description is already a choice of viewpoint, is already quite far along the thinking process. The nearest one can get to a raw situation, before it has been processed at all by thinking, is a visual situation, and geometric ones are preferable since they are more definite and the processing of them is more easily studied. With verbal descriptions, quite apart from the choice of viewpoint and the choice of words, there are nuances of meaning which can lead to misunderstanding. With a visual situation, no meaning is offered. The situation is just there and hence the same for everyone, even though they may process it differently. When the principles indicated by the artificial demonstrations have been understood, when there has been sufficient practice in the processes suggested, then one can move on to more real situations. It is exactly the same as learning mathematics on trivial and artificial problems and then using the processes on important ones. The amount of material supplied in this book is very limited. What is supplied more as an example than as anything else. Anyone who is teaching lateral thinking, either to students or to his own children, must supplement the material offered here with his own material. Visual material. The following material may be collected and used. 1. In the section dealing with the progressive arrangement of cardboard shapes, one can make up this sort of shape and also devise new patterns for illustrating the same thing. In addition, one can ask the students themselves to devise new shapes. 2. Photographs and pictures can be taken from newspapers and from magazines. These are especially useful in the section on different ways of looking at and interpreting a situation. The captions would naturally be removed. For convenience, the pictures could be mounted on cardboard. If a magazine contains several useful pictures, then a number of copies could be bought and used as permanent material. 3. Drawings of scenes or people in action can be provided by the students themselves. A drawing provided by one student is objective material for everyone else. The complexity or accuracy of the drawing is not important, since what matters is the way it is looked at by the others. 4. In the sections which call for the execution of designs as drawings, these provide abundant material not only for the current set of students but for subsequent one. Verbal material. This can include written, spoken, or recorded material. 1. Written material can be obtained from newspapers or magazines. 2. Written material can be supplied by the teacher writing on a particular theme with a definite point of view. 3. Written material can be supplied by the students who are asked to write a short piece on some particular theme. 4. Spoken material can be derived from radio programs, from recordings of radio programs, and from deliberate recording of simulated speeches. 5. Spoken material can be obtained from the students themselves, one of whom may be asked to talk about a certain subject. Problem material. The problem format is a convenient one for encouraging deliberate thinking. It is very difficult to think of a problem just when one is required. There are different sorts of problem. 1. General world problems such as food shortage. These are obviously open-ended problems. 2. More immediate problems such as traffic control in cities. These are problems with which the students may have come into direct contact. 3. Immediate problems. These concern the direct everyday interaction at school. If one does deal with personal problems, it is probably best to deal with them in an abstracted way, as if talking about third parties. 4. Design and innovation problems. These are requests to bring about a certain effect. They usually apply to concrete objects, but they can also apply to organization or ideas. 5. Closed problems. These are problems for which there is a definite answer. There is a way of doing something and it is seen to work when it is found. Such problems may be practical ones or artificial ones. Problems can be derived from many different sources. 1. A general glance at a newspaper will generate world or more immediate problems. 2. Problems may be suggested by everyday life. 3. Problems may be suggested by the students. The teacher asks for problems and then stockpiles the suggestions. 4. Design problems may be generated by taking any item and asking how it might be done in a better way. More elaborate design problems can be generated by taking some task which has to be performed by hand and asking for a machine to do the same thing or a device to make it easier. One could also just ask for a simpler way to do it. 5. Closed problems are rather difficult to find. They must have a definite answer which is difficult enough to make the problem interesting but quite obvious once it has been found. There are some classic problems which one may know or be told about. It is, however, a bad idea to go to a puzzle book, since many of the problems involve quite ordinary mathematical tricks which have nothing to do with lateral thinking. One simple way of generating closed problems is to take some ordinary task and then restrict the starting conditions. For instance, one may want to draw a circle without using a compass. Once the problem has been set in this way, then one solves it for oneself before offering it to others. Themes. There are times when one just wants a subject for consideration. These are not actual problems, nor are they expressions of a particular point of view. It is a matter of having a subject area in which to move and develop ideas. These can be obtained in various ways. 1. Simply by looking around one, taking an object and elaborating it into a theme. 2. By glancing at a newspaper and deriving a theme for each headline. 3. By asking the students to generate themes. Anecdotes and stories. These are probably the most effective way of putting across the lateral thinking idea, but they are extremely difficult to generate. 1. From collections of fables or folk stories. 2. By making a note of incidents from one's own experience or that of others, news items, etc. Stockpile of material. It always seems much easier to think up material as required than it really is. It is better to gradually build up a stockpile of material. Newspaper cuttings, photos, problems, stories, anecdotes, themes, and ideas suggested by the students. One gradually builds up a file of such things and then can use them as needed. In addition, there is the advantage that with use one can learn which items are particularly effective. One can also come to predict the standard responses to the items. Anecdotes, stories, and problems should make a point about lateral thinking. Themes should be neutral, specific enough to excite definite ideas but wide enough for a variety of ideas to be offered. Pictures should be capable of different interpretations. A man holding a tin of corned beef is suitable, but fireman putting out a fire is not. A woman looking in a mirror can be ambiguous, so can policemen arresting a man or soldiers marching down a street. It is enough if you yourself can think of at least 2 different interpretations. In contrast, the verbal material should be as definite as possible. An article should offer a committed point of view, even a fanatical point of view. A general uncommitted appraisal is not so much use unless one is looking for background information to help consideration of a theme. In putting across the idea of lateral thinking as in teaching any sort of thinking, it is possible to talk in abstract terms, but what really makes things clear is actual involvement. The involvement may start with abstract geometric shapes and then the process is transferred bodily to more real situations. It is useful to keep going back to the simple shapes to emphasize the process, for if one sticks entirely to real situation, the nature of the process may get very blurred. There is also the real danger that in considering real situations one comes to think in terms of collecting more information, whereas the whole idea of lateral thinking is concept restructuring. Distinctness of lateral thinking. It may seem artificial to separate lateral thinking and try to teach it on its own when it is so much a part of thinking. There is a reason for doing this. Many of the processes of lateral thinking are quite contradictory to the other processes of thinking. Unless a clear distinction is made, there is the danger of giving the impression that lateral thinking undermines what is being taught elsewhere by introducing doubt. It is by keeping lateral thinking distinct from vertical thinking that one can avoid this danger and come to appreciate the value of both. Lateral thinking is not an attack on vertical thinking, but a method of making it more effective by adding creativity. The other danger which arises from failure to keep lateral thinking separate is the vague feeling that one is teaching it anyway in the course of teaching other things, and therefore there is no need to do anything special about it. In practice, such an attitude is quite wrong. Everyone naturally feels that they themselves use lateral thinking and that they always encourage it in their students. It is very easy to have this feeling, but the fundamental nature of lateral thinking is so different from that of vertical thinking that it is impossible to teach both at the same time. It is not enough to introduce a mild flavor of lateral thinking. One wants to develop enough skill in it for it to be used effectively, not just acknowledged as a possibility. Organization of chapters of this book. Each chapter is divided into 2 parts. 1. Background material. Theory and nature of the process being discussed in that section. 2. Practical format for trying out and using the process under discussion.